Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from Alessia Cara, titled Know It All. Okay, so whenever you got a new act that blew up with tons of buzz, critical success, and mainstream crossover, you tend to have a lot of acts following right behind them that just want to cash in. Sometimes it feels natural, a trend that was growing that finally burst through. But more often than not, it's a bit more cynical as otherwise popular acts try to jump on the sound. And in some cases, they might not even have a choice, especially if the label is pushing them in that direction. You stick to your typical sound, become irrelevant, or you jump into something new that might not fit what you're trying to do. But when you have a success story like Lord's Pure Heroin breaking out in 2013, major labels encountered an act that wasn't exactly easy to replicate. Sure, the immediate impact is a whole slew of pop acts that washed out their mixes, piled on the reverb and vocal filters, and focused a lot more on percussion over melody, probably to the wrong results, but they weren't ever really to capture that same vibe. Lord's formula was more than just instrumentation, it ran her smart songwriting and populism, and that's really hard to pull off without feeling inauthentic. Hell, look at Halsey's disastrous fumble with New Americana, one of the worst songs of this year. And as such, I wasn't exactly surprised when I heard that Def Jam had placed a major push behind Alessia Cara, a young Canadian singer-songwriter drawing more on old-school R&B for her debut EP, as you'd expect given the current popularity of R&B right now, but her lead-off single here was much more reminiscent of Lorde, not just in her thin, slightly husky delivery, but in the subversion of your typical party vibe with overwritten lyrics, to the point where some people were legitimately angry that it didn't net the same Grammy nominations Lorde got. Now, I wasn't wild about here when I covered it a couple months ago on Billboard Breakdown, and thus I was kind of reticent about covering this album, especially given the very rushed production schedule by her label to push it out before Christmas. But I figured I might as well give it some sort of chance, especially considering how many of you just kept on asking for it. So on that note, how did Know It All turn out? Oh boy. This is gonna be one of those cases that if I'm gonna get angry at all, it's not gonna be at Alessia Cara, but at her label Def Jam, because this is the sort of pop debut that should be way better than it is. And the exasperating thing is, again, this isn't Alessia Cara's fault so much as it is her producers and label executives, who you can tell were told to cram together enough songs to pad out an album and just ship it out early. All across the album, you can see spots where if they'd been given sharper oversight or more of a budget or another 3 or 4 months of development, they could have hit with a lot more impact. But as it is, Know It All feels rushed and only decent as a result of it, with the seeds of really good potential trampled by production that's far beneath her. In other words, this should have been great, but right now it's only just merely good. So before we get into that in detail, let's talk about Alessia Cara herself. And let me open up the backlash floodgate immediately and say that her voice hasn't completely won me over. Well, it's because her influences stand pretty tall over her writing and delivery. The biggest, as I mentioned before, is Lorde, but Alessia Cara is gunning for something that's less wise beyond her years and more relatable to her teenage audience. As such, she doesn't quite have a huge amount of stage presence behind the microphone. We'll come back to this, and you can definitely tell her vocal control can use a little bit of tuning and refinement with a little bit more practice, if alternatively her antisocial bitterness and painful earnestness does play to her advantage. Her inexperience can work to her benefit, I'll give her that. And nowhere is that more apparent than in the songwriting. I'll definitely give her this. She's got a knack for technical rhyming and flow that can feel a little bit off kilter at points, but combined with some very solid descriptions and self-awareness, it can lead to some really good moments. One thing you notice that there's a very cautious vulnerability about her presentation that reveals a lot of second-guessing and following from behind, acutely aware of her own age and not particularly comfortable with her breakout success. And really, this sort of attitude can be a very mixed blessing. And a lead-off single here, best example. The writing seems to encapsulate that intense anxiety that can come with a party where you just want to leave and everyone is vapid and obnoxious, but it also runs right up to the line of standoffish, where you have to ask why anyone would have even bothered to invite her to this party in the first place. Where things work better are on I'm Yours, where her head is actively exasperated with the idea of falling in love and the massive inconvenience it's going to be to her schedule, but then she's cautiously going to try anyway. Not gonna lie, that song kind of related to me a bit. And then there's Scars to Your Beautiful, where there's actually some pretty dark songwriting surrounding what girls would conceal and hide to be seen as flawless and without pain, concealing it through cutting and anorexia. And yet, I can't help but feel that if Alessia Cara dug deeper into this material and the psychology behind it, and didn't feel she had to default to the pop chorus and construct to go very uplifting with the song, we could have got something with a lot more impact. But then again, I'd say that about the majority of the writing on this album. Not so much that it's bad or even bland, but it's not playing to Alessia Cara's strengths. Not only does her thinner voice not lend itself to big anthemic choruses at all, it feels feels like she's stripping down bigger, more complicated concepts to an easy hook, like on extremely generic Wild Things or Overdose. And she doesn't really need to do that. She's a smart enough songwriter to go for more depth here. Take Stars, for instance. It's loaded with a bunch of cute space references that I like, but I do like how much of the track focuses on how we have to open up and give of ourselves in relationships to find that brighter spark. Hell, if we're looking for a theme of this album, it'd be the celebration of that vulnerability and honesty over throwing up walls or false pretenses. And we got more of that writing, I'd be very much behind this album instead of some just generic self-esteem anthems. All of which are some potent ideas that the production does absolutely nothing to complement. Once again, we get percussion overloaded mixes that crush any melody into a faded slurry, especially on the back half of this album. And while you can make the Lorde comparison, at least Lorde had the presence to anchor tracks in a stronger melodic foundation. The compositions were better. I'll give Alessia Cara some credit for trying to wedge in more guitar on I'm Yours and 17, but it's often the first thing that squashed the back of the mix behind wiry, oily synth lines and thicker beats that are nowhere near organic enough to flatter her vocals. What we get instead are fragments. Good fragments like the Ike's Rap 2 sample on here with the horns is excellent. I like when they showed up again on Outlaws, and there are melodies like the piano and Stars and the bubbly guitar lines on I'm Yours, but again, they're only fragments and not much of a foundation that I'll remember. If you don't have those good melodic hooks, they're not gonna stick with me here. With the hand claps and whistles thrown on top almost as a perfunctory measure, as if they have to be there. And when we get to songs like the acoustic ballad Stone, or the R&B touch flavor of Four Pink Walls or Outlaws that tries for a bit of Amy Winehouse minus the glamour, it really does fall flat for me because so much of the instrumentation and production feels so recycled and syncopated drum machines. I've heard a lot of this instrumentation done before, done better this year and last year. I could see Alessia Cara working with instrumentation that was a little bit more lush and organic. She calls back to the late 90s, early 2000s a fair bit, and it sounds really good. She's got the voice for that sort of adult alternative sound, but too much of this record ends up feeling very stiff and monochromatic and cold. It does nothing to flatter her whatsoever. In other words, it's a classic example of a label not giving Alessia Cara enough time to expand and refine her sound before rushing out a debut to capitalize on her success right now. I'll give her credit for convincing her label to position Here as a lead-off single, to at least define her and give her a personality to the mainstream, but this record unfortunately doesn't do much beyond that first initial setting of the stage. A talented songwriter could use a little bit of fine-tuning to make something truly great. She has a great pop album in her, I believe that. But then again, I know there will be plenty who will look past the production, probably won't nitpick the same I will, and definitely can see the writing resonating with a lot of her fans. So for me, it's a light 6 out of 10 and a cautious recommendation, but I gotta be honest here. Outside of a few songs, I doubt I'll remember this. And Alessia Cara, she deserves a better legacy than this debut. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out in the very last few weeks of the year that you want me to cover, I'm gonna try to squeeze them in before I get my year-end list, which start up next week. And keep in mind, once again, this is all my opinion, for whatever that's worth. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.